She stood under the studio lights, wearing a gold cross and her grandmother's photo. Millions watched, expecting an apology. Instead, she pulled out the Constitution and exposed the judge's ignorance on live TV. What she said next silenced the nation. But let's start from the beginning. The cross that sparked outrage. It was supposed to be just another quiet afternoon in the Manchester City Council chambers. A procedural hearing about the inclusion of faith-based speech in public forums. A few council members sat slouched behind their microphones, bored but attentive. The courtroom wasn't packed, just a few attendees, a local reporter, and a C-SPAN camera quietly recording in the corner. Nothing seemed unusual, until Karoline Leavitt took the stand. Karoline wasn't a stranger to the spotlight. At 28, she was already making waves as a political commentator and former White House staffer. She had a sharp tongue, sharper intellect, and a presence that immediately quieted the room. But on that day, her strongest statement wasn't what she said. It was what she wore. A small, delicate gold cross hung just below the neckline of her white blouse. Subtle, elegant, but unmistakably Christian. And for her, deeply personal. It was a piece passed down from her grandmother, Margaret Leavitt, a Holocaust survivor who had found her faith again in the ashes of loss. Karoline wore it not just as a symbol of belief, but of legacy, of strength, of survival. She had been invited to testify as a community voice about First Amendment protections in local government events. Her opening statement was calm, respectful, and well-prepared. "Religious freedom isn't just a constitutional principle," she said clearly. "It's a cornerstone of our national identity." But she hadn't gotten more than a minute into her remarks when a sharp voice cut through the chamber. "That necklace," Judge Harold Winslow said, squinting down from the elevated bench. "Remove it immediately." Karoline looked up, stunned. "I beg your pardon, Your Honor?" "The cross. That's a religious symbol. This chamber is a secular space. Wearing it while testifying implies endorsement of a specific faith. That's a violation of neutrality." A hush fell over the room. Even the clerk stopped typing. For a moment, no one moved. "Sir," Karoline replied, keeping her voice composed, "this is not a statement. It's my family's—" "Enough," he snapped, raising his hand. "If you do not remove that necklace, I will hold you in contempt of court." The council members exchanged uneasy glances. Even those who disagreed with her politics appeared shocked by the abruptness, the aggression. Karoline didn't move. She looked the judge directly in the eye. "I will not remove it." Winslow's jaw clenched. "Then I'm fining you $500 for contempt. Your testimony is stricken from the record." The gavel slammed. The sound echoed in the chamber like a gunshot. And just like that, the room exploded. Reporters scrambled for quotes. Council members murmured among themselves. The camera zoomed in on Karoline's expression. Calm, stoic, unmoved. She slowly turned, gathered her notes, and walked out. The footage hit social media within the hour. A short clip, barely 40 seconds, but it spread like wildfire. Tens of thousands of reposts, then hundreds of thousands. Headlines multiplied across platforms. Judge fines woman over necklace. Contempt charge for wearing a cross. Religious freedom on trial in Manchester. By the next morning, Karoline's inbox was flooded with hate, praise, outrage, threats, support. Everyone had an opinion. The networks called. So did talk shows. Politicians, pastors, law students, constitutional scholars. But the center of the storm remained one quiet moment. A woman standing firm and a judge striking her down, not for words, but for a symbol around her neck. What few knew, however, was what that symbol meant to her. To Karoline, it wasn't about politics or optics. It was about her grandmother, Margaret, who had survived Auschwitz by clinging to the belief that one day she would find peace in a free land. And she did. She came to America, rebuilt a life, and wore that same cross every Sunday until her final breath. "Never let anyone take this from you," Margaret had once whispered to Karoline when she was just 10. "Not even if they wear a robe and call themselves powerful." Karoline had never expected to be tested on that promise. Certainly not in a courtroom. Certainly not by a man sworn to uphold the very Constitution that protected her right to wear it. But now she had been, and the world was watching. Some called it a publicity stunt. Others said it was an attack on secular government. But to those who understood, to those who had ever felt silenced or punished for what they believed, this was something else. This was a warning that even in the land of the free, even in a quiet town, your faith could be fined. And what Karoline did next would decide whether that warning became a precedent or a turning point. Because behind the quiet dignity of her walk out of that courtroom was the beginning of a storm she was about to unleash. Pain behind the silence. The door to the chamber clicked shut behind her, but the sound felt like a cannon blast. Karoline stood in the hallway alone, clutching her folder, her fingertips trembling slightly. It wasn't the fine. She could pay that 10 times over. It wasn't even the public reprimand. It was something deeper, something colder. It was the silence. The silence that followed after injustice, when no one, not one council member, not even a reporter, stood up and said, "Wait, this isn't right." She hadn't just been fined. She'd been left alone to carry the weight of it. As she walked toward the elevator, her heels echoing against the marble floor, a janitor looked up from mopping and gave her a small nod, nothing more. But it was the kindest gesture she'd received since the gavel dropped. By the time she reached her car, her phone had already begun vibrating nonstop. Missed calls, texts, social media exploding. Her team group chat was flooded. This went viral. Everyone's reposting the clip. Some are pissed. Some are calling it fake. CNN already picked it up. Be careful what you say. She sat in the driver's seat but didn't start the engine. She looked down at the little cross, still hanging around her neck. She hadn't taken it off. She wouldn't. But suddenly, it felt unbearably heavy. Karoline closed her eyes. In her mind, she was 10 years old again, sitting cross-legged on the carpet in her grandmother's living room. Margaret's hands, lined with time and grief, gently fastened the cross around Karoline's neck for the first time. "This isn't jewelry," she'd whispered. "It's a reminder that truth will always cost you something. The question is, are you willing to pay?" Back then, the words sounded like a story. Now, they sounded like a prophecy. Later that evening, Karoline sat alone in her apartment, the lights dimmed, a cup of cold tea untouched on the table. Her inbox was still overflowing. Requests for interviews, demands for statements, death threats. Messages that started with "you Christian whore" and ended with "you're what's wrong with America." But buried in between were messages that made her stop scrolling. "My daughter saw you on TV and asked why that man hated your necklace. I haven't worn my cross to work in 2 years. Tomorrow I will. I'm a Muslim, and I still stand with you. This wasn't about Christianity. It was about control." Tears welled up before she could stop them. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want a need to cry, but she let them fall. It wasn't just pain from humiliation. It was the pain of legacy being spit on. Her grandmother had survived death camps where people were killed because of symbols like the one she wore today. And now, in a free nation, she had been publicly punished for it. By a judge, no less. But Karoline also knew something else. Something dangerous. If she stayed silent now, The narrative would be shaped without her. They'd spin it. Attention-seeking. Religious extremist. Right-wing stunt. And she knew the media wouldn't care about her grandmother. They wouldn't care about history. They'd care about ratings. That night, she called her closest friend, Noah Jensen, a constitutional law professor at NYU, and a man who had once told her, "The First Amendment is only as strong as the people willing to bleed for it." He picked up on the first ring. "Karoline?" "I need help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm already watching the clip," he replied. "This is bigger than a fine. You realize that, right?" "Yes, and I think I need to remind people what the law actually says." There was a long pause on the line. "You're going to go public?" "I have to. Not because it's about me. Because if this goes unchallenged, it sets a precedent. If a cross today, then a yarmulke tomorrow. A hijab next week. Then silence." He sighed. "You know the cost. I wore this cross through protests, debates, even DC press briefings, and nobody dared touch it. But one local judge thinks he's above the Constitution? Then you need to hit back harder than he expects," Noah said. "Live TV?" she asked. "National stage," he confirmed. "I'll prep you on precedent, but you don't need legal notes." Karoline smiled faintly. "No, I already have my ammunition." The next morning, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, staring at her own reflection. Her eyes were tired but clear. No makeup yet. No lights. Just her and the truth. She took the cross in her hand, kissed it softly, and whispered, "This is for you, Grandma." She put on a second chain, one she hadn't worn in years, a locket with a faded black and white photo of Margaret Leavitt in 1950, standing in front of a small church in Brooklyn, smiling, alive, free. As she walked out of the apartment, the morning sun broke through the clouds, one of those strange, symbolic New England skies where warmth and storm seemed to exist in the same frame. It was time. The judge had made his statement in court. Now she would make hers, on live television, in front of a nation. But not just to fight back, to teach him and the world what real authority sounds like when it isn't backed by fear, but by truth. The spark of defiance. The call came early, earlier than expected. The producer from Live America Tonight left a voicemail, her tone carefully measured, professionally curious. "Miss Leavitt, we saw the footage and would love to offer you a few minutes on our Friday broadcast. Just a short conversation. Let me know." Karoline didn't respond right away. She sat with her phone in hand, watching the sun creep across the hardwood floor of her kitchen. The decision wasn't about publicity. It was about truth. But the moment she finally pressed call back, she knew this wasn't just a segment. It was the platform she needed. Not to clear her name, but to speak for everyone who had ever been told to keep your faith quiet or leave your beliefs at the door. The next day, as she walked into the Manhattan studio, there was a buzzing tension in the air. Makeup artists and camera crew darted back and forth. Teleprompters scrolled silently, and somewhere in the background, dramatic music played softly, a cue of anticipation. She was led to a quiet waiting area where she sat, hands folded. The walls around her were lined with framed headlines. "Whistleblower reveals truth. One voice changes everything." When America listened, she smiled wryly. Let's see if they'll listen now. Just before air, a production assistant approached her. "Anything you want to avoid?" he asked. The host might ask about politics. "I'm not here for politics," she replied. "I'm here for something older than that." He nodded but didn't ask what she meant. Then she was ushered into the studio. The host, Megan Dorsey, a respected journalist known for sharp interviews and no-nonsense delivery, greeted her with a firm handshake. "Thanks for coming, Karoline. You've stirred quite the debate. Karoline smiled politely. Good. Debate is healthy, silence isn't. The countdown began. 5, 4, 3, 2. Red light. Cameras live. Welcome back to Live America Tonight. Our next guest is no stranger to headlines this week. Karoline Leavitt, fined during a city council testimony for wearing a cross, joins us now. Karoline, thanks for being here. Thank you, Megan. Let's get straight to it, Megan said. Why wear the cross to that hearing? You had to know it might provoke a reaction. Karoline leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but resolute. I wore it because I always do. It's not a provocation. It's a part of who I am, and of who my grandmother was. She survived Auschwitz, came here, and told me never to be ashamed of faith. I wasn't about to betray that legacy in front of a judge. Megan nodded, her expression unreadable. But some say the judge had a point, that government spaces should be secular. Karoline didn't flinch. And they are. But secular doesn't mean sterile. It means the government doesn't endorse religion. It doesn't mean the government gets to erase it from individuals. That's not neutrality. That's coercion. Megan raised an eyebrow. So you're saying your constitutional rights were violated? Karoline reached under the table and pulled out a thick folder. I'm saying we've forgotten our own laws. Let me remind us. She opened the folder, lifting several pages clipped with tabs and notes. Then she began to read. In Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969, the Supreme Court ruled that students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. In West Virginia State Board v. Barnett, the court held that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in matters of religion or belief. She looked up. Now tell me, if students in schools and children in courtrooms are protected, why not a citizen testifying before her own government? Megan's silence wasn't the awkward kind. It was the kind born from realization, from impact. I don't need a law degree to read the Constitution, Karoline continued. I just need to care enough to not let anyone erase it. Not for me, not for anyone. The studio was quiet. Even the crew seemed to lean in. Then Karoline added something unexpected. She reached for the second necklace she wore, the one no one had noticed yet, and lifted the small locket into view. This is Margaret Leavitt. She came to America after surviving the camps. The last thing she gave me was this cross. The last thing she asked was, promise me they'll never take it from you. She paused, her eyes glistening. I intend to keep that promise. The segment ended. The cameras cut. But the moment didn't. Megan Dorsey leaned forward, her voice low but sincere. That was one of the clearest, most powerful defenses of personal liberty I've ever heard. Karoline nodded, quietly. It wasn't mine. I just repeated what the Constitution already said. The response was instant. Clips of her segment flooded social media. The phrase, I don't need a law degree to read the Constitution, trended worldwide. Viewers began filming themselves wearing religious symbols, crosses, stars of David, crescent pendants, with the hashtag #WeStandWithCaroline. By the end of the day, even major constitutional law scholars weighed in. She's absolutely right. Judge Winslow overstepped his authority. This isn't about religion. It's about control. In New Hampshire, things moved quickly. Local news stations replayed the broadcast. Editorials were printed overnight. And behind the scenes, state ethics committees began whispering about reviewing the judge's conduct. But Karoline didn't gloat. When a reporter asked how she felt about changing the national conversation, she only replied, I didn't change it. I reminded it. Freedom of belief isn't a trend. It's a birthright. And for the first time since that gavel dropped, She didn't feel alone anymore. The fine still stood. The judge hadn't responded, but the people had. And that spark, born from silence, pain, and memory, had become something far louder. A defiance grounded not in rage, but in truth. Turning the tables. The night after her live TV appearance, Karoline couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety, but from adrenaline, the kind that only came after stepping into a storm and realizing you weren't alone in it. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Not from trolls, not anymore. From strangers, veterans, pastors, immigrants. Even a rabbi from Chicago who wrote, "You carried us all with that one sentence. Secular doesn't mean sterile. Thank you for reminding America." By morning, her inbox held over 6,000 messages. Most were support. A few were stories. One was different. It came from an anonymous email account. The subject line read, "Winslow's past rulings. You're not the first." Inside was a PDF. 2 cases, different people, different years. Both dismissed by Winslow, both involving religious expression. One about a public school teacher suspended for having a Bible on her desk. Another involving a Sikh man asked to remove his turban in a government ID photo. In both, the judge had sided with institutions. Karoline leaned back in her chair. This wasn't just about her. It never was. It was a pattern, a mindset. And suddenly, she realized, this wasn't the end of her fight. It was the beginning of his reckoning. 2 days later, Karoline held a press conference outside the Manchester courthouse. A modest podium, a single mic. Reporters lined the sidewalk, cameras set up like rifles, ready to shoot questions. She began calmly, with her usual grace. But her words carried the weight of a storm. When I was fined in this building for wearing a cross, some said it was just a misunderstanding. But I've reviewed Judge Winslow's record. This wasn't an accident. It was a habit. One that undermines every person's constitutional rights, regardless of their faith. She pulled the microphone slightly closer. This is not a personal vendetta. This is a public call for accountability. I'm formally requesting a judicial ethics review of Judge Harold Winslow's conduct, past and present. Gasps rippled through the crowd. One reporter raised a hand. Karoline, aren't you afraid of backlash? You're going after a sitting judge. I'm not going after him, she replied. I'm standing between him and the next person he tries to silence. The ethics board responded faster than anyone anticipated. Within 48 hours, they released a brief statement. We are reviewing complaints related to recent and past decisions made by Judge Harold Winslow concerning First Amendment rights. It wasn't a ruling, but it was a crack, and in that crack, truth began to shine through. National media picked up the story again. Morning shows debated it. Legal analysts explained the stakes. Commentators across the political spectrum, even those who once dismissed Karoline, admitted the judge had overstepped. On the Morning Wire, a prominent liberal host said, I may not agree with Karoline Leavitt on much, but on this, she's absolutely right. You don't get to fine someone for a necklace. That night, Karoline returned to Live America Tonight for a follow-up segment. But this time, she didn't bring a folder of rulings. She brought a name. Megan Dorsey looked intrigued. You've uncovered something? Karoline nodded. Yes. A man named Omar Bhatt, Sikh American, fined in this very courthouse 6 years ago for refusing to remove his turban during a government interview. Same judge, same logic, different target. She paused, then added, I called him. He didn't even know he could fight back. Megan leaned forward, her voice softer. What did he say? Karoline's eyes burned with quiet fire. He said, I thought it was just me. I thought I didn't belong here. The audience gasped. Megan sat back slowly, stunned. And that, Karoline said firmly, is what silence creates. Isolation, shame. People start to believe injustice is normal, and that's where systems rot. She looked directly into the camera. I don't care if it's a cross, a turban, a yarmulke, or nothing at all. Your right to exist without erasure is not up for negotiation. It never was. The segment ended, but this time, it wasn't just viral, it was historic. The next day, a major legal organization, the American Center for Religious Liberty, publicly backed her. They issued a statement calling for Judge Winslow's resignation and offered free legal support to any citizen previously impacted by his rulings. Then came the breaking news. An internal memo from the Judicial Conduct Commission was leaked. In it, committee members discussed repeated bias toward secular overreach and documented disregard for religious protections. The pressure mounted. Editorials ran under headlines like, "The Judge Who Forgot the Constitution," Karoline Leavitt, "One Woman, One Cross, One Reckoning." Judge Winslow remained silent. His office refused interviews. But sources whispered that behind closed doors he was fuming. He called it a media ambush, a witch hunt. He still didn't get it. It wasn't about him. It was about us. 1 week later, a town hall was organized by citizens in Manchester. Karoline was invited to speak, not as a pundit, not as a guest, but as a representative. The hall was packed. At the end of her speech, she said something that echoed far beyond the walls of that room. We are not powerless, and we are not alone. Silence may be the weapon of tyrants, but truth is a megaphone for the people. The crowd erupted. Some stood. Others wept. And among them, in the third row, sat an old man wearing a yarmulke, a young woman in a hijab, a teen with a rainbow pin, and a mother clutching a crucifix. Different faces, same fight, different stories, one constitution, and now, one voice leading them. Public awakening. The tide didn't just shift, it roared. By the end of the second week, Karoline's speech had amassed over 18 million views across platforms. Her quote, "Silence may be the weapon of tyrants, but truth is a megaphone for the people," appeared on posters, tweets, stickers, and even hand-painted signs outside courthouses. What started as a single moment in a quiet New Hampshire courtroom had become a national moment of reckoning. In cities across the country, Boston, Austin, Phoenix, Milwaukee, rallies began forming. They weren't angry mobs. They were citizens holding candles, standing shoulder to shoulder, wearing symbols of identity once hidden out of fear. Necklaces, turbans, stars of David, rainbow pins, hijabs, veteran caps, even wedding rings from same-sex couples once afraid to wear them publicly. They stood not to scream, but to be seen. And across all of it, Karoline's image was there, not posed or polished, but that still frame from the moment she stood defiantly before the judge. Eyes locked, mouth calm, necklace shining. For the first time in years, the conversation had shifted away from culture wars and toward the human cost of silence. In Washington, D.C., something unexpected happened. 3 senators, a Republican, a Democrat, and an independent, co-sponsored a resolution reaffirming the constitutional right to personal expression in all public civic spaces. "We shouldn't need to pass something like this in 2025, one of them said on the floor. But maybe we've forgotten how fragile freedom becomes when comfort replaces conviction." News anchors stopped calling Karoline the conservative firebrand. They started calling her the accidental patriot. But Karoline rejected the title. "There's nothing accidental about standing up for what's right," she told one interviewer. "It's not political. It's personal." Behind the scenes, more developments came crashing in. Judge Winslow, still refusing to speak publicly, had quietly submitted a statement to the Judicial Conduct Commission defending his actions as procedural neutrality. But that defense crumbled when another former courtroom attendee, an elderly Jewish man named Saul Lieberman, came forward and revealed that he too had been asked by Winslow to remove any distracting headgear during jury selection 5 years ago. "It was my yarmulke," Saul said. "He told me it might influence the defendant unfairly. I was humiliated, but I kept quiet. I thought, maybe he was right." Karoline called him the next day. He cried when she said thank you. In churches and synagogues, in mosques and community centers, sermons and talks now referenced the Leavitt case. It had become a metaphor, a symbol, and most unexpectedly, in public schools. In dozens of classrooms, teachers asked students, "What would you do if someone told you to hide what you believe?" Some students wrote essays. Others performed small mock trials. One fourth-grade girl from Ohio wrote, "My grandma wears a scarf on her head. She says it's because she loves God. I told her she should never take it off for anyone, because Karoline didn't." The teacher mailed Karoline that note. She kept it on her fridge. Yet despite the outpouring of support, Karoline remained grounded. Her team urged her to launch a podcast, to sign book deals, to run for office. She declined everything. "This isn't about me," she kept saying. It never was. Instead, she founded a nonprofit organization called Unmuted, a legal advocacy and storytelling initiative dedicated to protecting freedom of expression in civic spaces. Within a month, they had over 80 volunteer attorneys and hundreds of active case submissions. One of the first cases they took on? A teenage girl in Oregon suspended for praying silently before a school presentation. When reporters asked if Karoline would be representing her personally, she simply smiled. "If that's where I'm needed, yes." Meanwhile, the Judicial Ethics Committee reached a final decision. Judge Winslow was found to have demonstrated a pattern of unconstitutional rulings which suppressed constitutionally protected expression in public institutions. He was issued a formal censure, the strongest available measure short of removal, and placed on indefinite administrative leave. Sources later revealed that under mounting pressure, he chose to resign quietly rather than face further public hearings. But Karoline didn't comment on his resignation. When asked by the press how she felt, she said only, "I didn't want him punished. I wanted the system to remember its purpose." One moment, one necklace, one voice. That's what the headlines said. But for Karoline, it was something deeper. Late one night, alone in her apartment, she stood before her bookshelf, gently pulling out a small, worn journal. Her grandmother Margaret's. She hadn't opened it in years. Inside, yellowed pages held scribbled prayers, names of lost family, memories from Ellis Island. And on the back page, barely legible, her grandmother had written, "The cross I wear is not for protection. It is for courage. May you find yours when the world forgets." Karoline traced the words with her fingers. She didn't cry this time. She felt something different, peace, because the world hadn't forgotten. Not anymore. In one final gesture, she returned to the Manchester City Council chamber, the same room where it all began. She wore the same white blouse, the same 2 necklaces. But this time, she wasn't on trial. She was the keynote speaker at a ceremony marking a new city resolution: freedom of personal expression in civic spaces. She stood tall behind the same podium and smiled at the familiar faces in the crowd. Even some of the council members who once stayed silent looked different now, humbled, changed. "My grandmother believed that silence can be more dangerous than hatred," she said. "And I've learned that the smallest voice, if true, echoes louder than any gavel." And when she finished speaking, the entire room, from front row to back wall, rose in applause. Justice and a promise. Kept. The courtroom was empty now. Sunlight filtered in through the stained glass windows, dust dancing in the air like fragments of memory. The same bench where Judge Winslow once sat in judgment now stood unoccupied. The chair creaked in the silence. And yet, the room felt full, not with people, but with presence, with meaning. Karoline stood alone in the well of the court, hands clasped in front of her. No cameras, no reporters, no audience, just her, and everything that had led her here. A soft knock on the chamber door broke the quiet. The clerk poked her head in gently. "They've finalized it," she said. "The judge's resignation has been processed. He won't return." Karoline nodded. "Thank you." As the door clicked shut again, she exhaled, not with triumph, not with vengeance, but with release. It was over, or at least his part in it was. In the days that followed, tributes poured in, not to Karoline, but to what she had awakened. A New York Times editorial titled "The Cross That Saved the Constitution" went viral. A high school civics teacher in Iowa reported that over half her class had asked to write essays on the First Amendment. Unmuted, Karoline's nonprofit expanded to 5 new states, providing legal assistance to over 400 clients in its first quarter. Many of them, like Karoline, hadn't planned to fight. They were teachers, nurses, students, veterans, all punished, silenced, or pushed out of public view for daring to exist visibly. Karoline refused all awards. She declined talk show appearances, refused magazine covers. When offered a 7-figure book deal, she politely said, "This isn't a story about me. It's about all of us." But she made one exception. She agreed to appear on a Sunday morning show only if they'd let her speak uninterrupted for exactly 2 minutes. The host agreed, reluctantly. That morning, millions tuned in, and Karoline said this: "The Constitution doesn't protect institutions from offense. It protects individuals from erasure. And we've forgotten that. We've turned freedom into a popularity contest. But it was never meant to be safe. It was meant to be sacred. I didn't wear this cross to provoke. I wore it to remember a woman who survived the Holocaust, who came to America believing she'd never again be punished for her beliefs. She was wrong, but only for a moment. Because now, thanks to every person who stood up after her, I know she was also right. This country can still correct itself. It just needs people brave enough to remind it." That clip became one of the most watched 2-minute segments in network history. 2 weeks later, Karoline drove north, past the edge of the city, through the winding hills of rural New Hampshire, until she reached a quiet cemetery nestled beside a small chapel. She carried no speech, no camera, just a single laminated newspaper clipping and a bouquet of pale yellow roses. She found the gravestone easily. Margaret Leavitt, 1910 to 2005. She survived hell and still believed in heaven. Karoline knelt down slowly, brushing away a few leaves that had settled against the marble. "I kept it on," she whispered, touching the cross at her neck. "Even when they told me not to." She placed the newspaper gently against the headstone. The headline read, "Young Woman's Faith Sparks National Reckoning. Judge Resigns Amid Public Outcry." Beneath it, a photo of Karoline in the courtroom, standing tall, cross visible, jaw set, a mirror of the strength Margaret once carried across oceans and ash. Karoline looked up at the sky. "You were right," she said softly. "They did try to take it from me, but they couldn't." A breeze picked up, rustling the trees around her. The silence was no longer empty. It was peaceful. She sat there for a long time. No phones, no noise, no stage. Just a granddaughter, keeping a promise. Months passed. Life moved forward. But the story lingered, not as a headline, but as a lesson. In a courtroom in Texas, a Muslim woman won the right to testify while wearing her hijab. In Ohio, a judge issued an apology to a Jewish father barred from entering a city hall meeting while wearing a kippah. In Washington, bipartisan efforts emerged to expand judicial training on First Amendment protections. No one mentioned Karoline by name. They didn't have to. She had become something greater than a symbol. She had become a standard, a reminder that courage isn't loud, it's consistent, that faith isn't about volume, it's about presence, and that justice doesn't always wear robes. Sometimes it wears a cross on a thin gold chain. Back in Manchester, the city council voted unanimously to install a plaque in the very courtroom where it all began. It read, "In honor of those who stood when silence was safer." Freedom of belief is not granted by man, but protected by law. Karoline attended the ceremony quietly, sitting in the back row. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The moment had already spoken for her, and it would echo for generations.